Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and I told you about Longstreet's retirement to New Orleans and the political tinderbox that he entered into when he sided with the Republican Party in this early stage of Reconstruction. Now we see him leave the city for safer environs. Longstreet hadn't expected such anger and vitriol from his friends, associates, and business because of his statements toward and for the Republican Party. It would be the threats to himself and his family, as well as a yellow fever and cholera outbreak, that led him to move his family to Lynchburg, Virginia. He would return periodically to New Orleans, but wouldn't stay long. Being in Virginia, he often visited Washington, D.C., and his friend Ulysses S. Grant located there. In June 1868, Congress enacted a law restoring the political rights of many former Confederate officers. Longstreet was included in that number. He campaigned for Grant in his presidential bid and attended the inauguration. Grant nominated Longstreet for the position of Surveyor of Customs for the Port of New Orleans, with an annual $6,000 salary. Longstreet would travel to the Crescent City and arrive there by the middle of April 1869. One of his biographers explained the situation. Although he needed a job and income, many white Southerners thought that Longstreet had committed an unpardonable sin. It was one thing to endorse support for Republican Party policies. It was altogether another matter to hold a government position and participate in the Republican rule in the South. Newspapers immediately accused Longstreet of putting self-interest over principle. He was called a scalawag, a Southerner who betrayed his native region for power and money doled out by Republicans. His old friend, West Point classmate, and fellow General Harvey Hill typified the reaction to Longstreet's appointment when he wrote in a newspaper, "Our scalawag is the local leper of the community. Unlike the carpetbagger, a Northerner, Longstreet is a native, which is so much the worse." Lost cause myth had already begun to coalesce by this point in Reconstruction. The myth that the South never stood a chance of winning the war made those who were alive into heroes and those that died during the conflict martyrs. Longstreet had committed an unforgivable sin. As one biographer put it, to join the Republicans, the political instrument of conquest and defeat, was to betray those who had died for the cause and those who were living under an imposed rule by the conquerors. When Longstreet and his family returned to New Orleans, they were ostracized by the community, while being accepted and supported by the white Republicans of the city. In May 1870, the governor of Louisiana, Henry C. Warmoth, a Union veteran, appointed Longstreet the adjutant general of the 5,000-man state militia made up of white and black militiamen. The next month, he became the president of the New Orleans and Northeastern Railroad. Altogether, with his 3 jobs, he was making between $10,000 and $15,000 a year, quite a sum for the time. 2 years later, during some political infighting, where the Republican Party split between the governor and the Customs House faction, Longstreet took the governor's side and resigned from his Customs House position and as adjutant general. The election saw claims of fraud resulting in both the Customs House Republicans and the Democrats claiming victory. After Warmoth was impeached, President Grant recognized the Republican candidate, William H. Kellogg, as a legitimate governor. Longstreet assumed command of the militia and the New Orleans Metropolitan Police Force, and on Inauguration Night, his troops, along with federal soldiers, stopped the Democratic supporters from taking over the police stations. The next day, Longstreet's policemen occupied the International Order of Oddfellows Hall, the headquarters of the Democratic Party, and arrested everyone who was in there. They would soon be released by order of the governor. In response to losing the governorship and believing that they had indeed won it to begin with, the White Democrats of New Orleans formed the Crescent City White League, a paramilitary organization made up of former Confederates. When 6 Republican office holders were killed, it was thought to be the work of the White League. The governor declared martial law, and it was occupied by federal troops, along with Longstreet's police force. When the police found weapons smuggled into the city in boxes labeled machinery and addressed to the White League, the situation exploded. On the evening of September 14th, 8,400 armed White League members advanced on the State House in what would become known as the Battle of Liberty Place. Awaiting them was Longstreet, commanding 3,600 policemen and black militiamen, along with 2 Gatling guns and a battery of artillery. Longstreet rode out from his battle line and ordered the group to disperse. The White Leaguers pulled him down from his horse and opened fire. A battle ensued, with Longstreet being hit with a spent bullet and taken as a prisoner by the White Leaguers. The rebels pushed the militia and the police from the State House and took control of it. During the battle, 38 men were killed and 78 men were wounded. Grant would use federal troops to restore order and free Longstreet. In the coming elections, Democrats would take over the government in Louisiana, and the Republican rule ended. Longstreet's role in the battle with the White Leaguers made white Southerners hate him even more. He had led black troops against Confederate veterans. He would be relieved of duty with the militia following the battle. Longstreet's health caused the former general to relocate himself and his family to Georgia, not to mention the possibility of danger lurking in New Orleans because of his actions and rhetoric. The family had grown by the time it moved. A son named Fitz Randolph and a girl named Maria Louisa joined the family in 1869 and 1872 respectively. Longstreet's shoulder and arm still hurt him, still having no use of his right arm, and he suffered from rheumatism. His brother William, who lived in Gainesville, Georgia, convinced him to move to that area, which he did in the summer of 1875. He would purchase the Piedmont Hotel in town and buy land to build a farmhouse about 2 or 3 miles outside of town. Longstreet supported Rutherford B. Hayes for president, and when Hayes got elected, he vied for a position, particularly Collector of Customs in New Orleans and U.S. Marshal for Georgia, but those failed. He made frequent trips to New Orleans since he still remained on the board of directors for city schools, and administrator for the University of Louisiana, now Tulane University. In March 1877, he committed another sin in the white Southerners' minds. He converted to Catholicism, an egregious offense to the predominantly Protestant South. In January 1879, Longstreet would be appointed postmaster of Gainesville from the Hayes administration. The position allowed him to flirt with Georgia politics, but his political sense, as proven in Louisiana, was not up to par, and he stumbled through the political landscape. In 1880, Hayes appointed him the United States Minister to Turkey. By mid-December 1880, he was in Constantinople. Louise and the children would stay in Gainesville. Sultan Abdul Hamid Khan II welcomed the former Confederate general to the country, but Longstreet was ill-suited for the role. However, he did secure permission from Khan for American archaeologists to do research in Turkey, which was a reversal for the Sultan. That would pretty much be his only accomplishment. Just 3 months after his arrival, Longstreet requested and received a 60-day leave to tour Western Europe, during which he traveled to Austria, Prussia, and France. When he returned to Turkey, the United States government recalled him, and he would be made the U.S. Marshal for Georgia. Longstreet's predecessor had been part of fraud and wrongdoing. Not wanting the problems from the former Marshal to come back on him, he requested an audit. The House of Representatives appointed an investigator, and he found fraud on the books and found that one of the deputies that Longstreet had retained from the former Marshal was still committing crimes. The investigator advocated for an investigation by the Department of Justice, but the department refused to launch an investigation. The investigator also claimed that Longstreet was incompetent in his role as Marshal, so Longstreet wrote letters defending himself and even went before the House committee defending himself and his son Garland, who Longstreet had appointed Chief Deputy Marshal. Both were accused of incompetence. Through political dealings, some Georgia Republicans convinced President Chester A. Arthur to get rid of Longstreet, which he did by requesting his resignation. With the election of the first Democrat to the presidency in over 20 years in the form of Grover Cleveland in 1884, Longstreet knew that his political appointments would be over as long as the Democrats stayed in charge. He would go into semi-retirement in Gainesville.